And again, for those of you just joining us, welcome. We're going to give people just a couple of minutes to log on and to get situated, and then we'll get started. Welcome to those of you just joining us. We'll give people another 30 seconds to log on and get comfortable, and then we'll get started. We should have been playing Georgia on My Mind for this intro to welcome people in. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I know some people are still joining us, but we want to be mindful of everyone's time and make sure that we have plenty of time left for the conversation and for your questions. So good evening and welcome to Where Are We Now? Georgia Recounts and Runoff Elections, which is the third in a series of community conversations that have sought to put the 2020 elections in context. I'm Angela Dillard, and I've been serving as the chair of the Academic Advisory Committee for the Democracy and Debate theme semester, which is sponsoring this evening's discussion and which is being live captioned. Like so many of us, I've been struggling to keep one eye on the battle over election results in Pennsylvania and closer to home in Detroit, and the other eye on Georgia, where the control of the U.S. Senate hangs in the balance, even more so with today's announcement that the Alaska Senate race has been called for the Republican candidate, Dan Sullivan. We've seen dancing in the streets, press conferences outside of landscaping companies, claims, counterclaims, and outright conspiracy theories fueled by the internet and by our national partisan divide. And both sides of that divide are gearing up for the early January runoff elections in Georgia, in which first-term Senator David Perdue will face Democratic challenger Jon Ossoff, and Senator Kelly Loeffler, appointed to the Senate last year, will run off against Democrat, the Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock. It is, to say the least, challenging to figure out how to make sense of this moment and the broader implications of what we're witnessing. And on behalf of the Planning Committee for the theme semester, I want to express our gratitude to tonight's two faculty experts who have agreed to give in-the-minute context and commentary. This is not an easy thing to do, especially as events remain so fluid. So again, we're really thankful of their time and their talent with us here this evening. I'm going to briefly introduce them, invite them to say a few words, while you, members of the audience, have the opportunity to start to enter your questions into the Q&A function. So first we have Margo Schlanger, who is the Wade H. and Doris M. McCree Collegiate Professor of Law. She's a leading authority on civil rights issues in civil and criminal detention. She is the author of dozens of law review and other scholarly articles, and is a frequent commentator online and in print on civil rights topics. In addition to her research and writing, Professor Schlanger does substantial work in civil rights litigation and prison and immigration reform, and has a long and rich history as a litigator in public and governmental service, including for the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration. And she also continues to serve as an expert in numerous cases addressing detention conditions in different parts of the country. Professor Schlanger also founded and continues to run the Civil Rights Litigation Clearinghouse, which is a tremendous resource that promotes greater understanding of historical and contemporary American civil rights legislation and litigation. Professor Vince Hutchings is the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor of Political Science and Afro-American and African Studies, as well as a Diversity and Social Transformation Professor. His general interests include public opinion, elections, voting behavior, and African-American politics. He recently published a book at Princeton University Press entitled Public Opinion and Democratic Accountability: How Citizens Learn About Politics, that focuses on how and under what circumstances citizens monitor and consequently influence their elected representatives' voting behavior. And he's been involved in the studies of how the size of the African-American constituency and congressional districts can influence legislative responsiveness to Black interests. And among other things, he's currently the University of Michigan principal investigator for the American National Election Survey for the 2012 election cycle. And with that, let me just also take a moment to thank the people behind the scenes who keep us up and running, especially Catherine Carver, who is the co-lead on the theme semester planning committee, and who will be helping Professors Hutchings and Schlanger to field your questions and to keep track of things behind the scenes, and Mark Rivet, who is providing technical support. And finally, let me thank all of you for joining us for what promises to be a very smart, very lively conversation.
Great. So I think we take it from there. We're going to start off by talking about the kind of state of play in the presidential election, and then kind of hone in on Georgia. So, Vince, I think you're gonna start us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Margo, and thanks, Angela, and thanks to everyone responsible for organizing this event. So I'm just going to spend a few moments here describing what many of you may already know, since we've all been glued to our laptops or our televisions watching this election drama unfold and the outcome and the subsequent responses to the outcome. So we're here tonight to primarily discuss Georgia, and our comments will primarily focus on Georgia, and I'll describe what is the current situation in the state. But then I do want to also briefly mention some of the other battleground states and what the tally is in those states, because there is at least some discussion about potential lawsuits emerging in some or maybe even all of these to potentially overturn the outcome. So Georgia, which is the focus of our state, obviously of our discussion this evening. Georgia, of course, has 16 electoral votes, and obviously one needs to get 270 in order to be victorious in the presidential contest. So Georgia has 16 electoral votes, and the current description of the Biden victory at this point, and I'm phrasing it in those terms because, as I understand it, they are still literally counting ballots. But broadly speaking, Biden has a 14,000 vote margin in the state, which is a relatively substantial. We'll talk about that moving forward. And in addition, let me just say a few things about some of the other battleground states like Pennsylvania, which has 20 electoral votes. I'm just looking at my notes here. So Pennsylvania has 20 electoral notes, and Biden is currently ahead by about 47,000. It is true that there are 94,000 provisional ballots that are left to be counted, but it's not at all clear that all of these votes are going to be valid and consequently end up being counted. As a practical matter, it seems unlikely at this stage, given the size of the advantage, that a recount would change things. It's also worth noting that this 47,000 vote margin is roughly equivalent to, indeed slightly larger than the margin of victory that Trump had over Senator or Secretary of State Clinton in 2016. A few more, and then I'll turn this over to Margo. Arizona, of course, is also a battleground state, which I believe has not yet been officially called. It has 11 electoral votes. And Biden, at least when we last checked, was ahead by about 13,000 votes. 46,000 ballots roughly are still left to be counted. But given where those ballots are, what part of the state they're attributed to, it seems unlikely at this stage that there will be a sufficient margin of victory by Trump. I think he would have to win about 65 or some odd percent of them in order to overturn the outcome. That seems unlikely at this stage. Just moving down, just three more, and I'll conclude here for the moment. Wisconsin, of course, has been called for President-elect Biden. It has 10 electoral votes. Biden won the state in spite of what some of the pre-election polls were suggesting, which was that it would be by something close to a double-digit margin. Turned out to be a very slim margin of about 20,000 votes. But that's sufficient to win, and it's larger than the margin of victory in Michigan in 2016 by Trump, which is around 10,000, as I recall. Finally, or not finally yet, penultimate state would be Nevada, which is, I believe Nevada may have been called for Biden. And in any case, it's got 6 electoral votes, and Biden has won that by, or at least it's been called on his behalf by about 37,000. Lastly, of course, our own home state here of Michigan, where Biden has won the state, not by the margin that pre-election polls suggested, but still by a pretty healthy 145,000 vote margin. So it seems exceedingly unlikely that a recount would overturn that outcome. And I'll stop here, turn it over to my colleague.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you to the committee on all of these talks for inviting me. And it's nice to have everybody here in this conversation. So I'm gonna run through what the live disputes are in some of those states. And I'm gonna kind of handicap them a little bit. So, you know, your mileage may vary. This is just my opinion. So let's start with Georgia. Georgia, you know, the counting's not over yet, but unless the margin sinks down to something in the range of a couple thousand, excuse me, not dollars, a couple thousand votes, it seems really unlikely. There will be a recount in Georgia. There's no question about it. There would be one, even if it hadn't been requested, because of the closeness of the race. And in fact, the Trump administration requested a special recount, a hand recount, and the Secretary of State of Georgia, who's a Republican, agreed with that. A hand recount means that the scanners won't be used. And so people will be looking at the votes rather than scanners looking at the votes. There's not really much of a way to predict what will happen on this, but it seems unlikely to move very many votes. It seems more likely that what will happen is that a hand recount will delay the certification of the results and keep alive the Trump administration's effort to say that this election is not done yet, to say that we're still in doubt. It will just keep Georgia open, but it seems highly unlikely that it will actually change that it will change the outcome, and that Vice President Biden won't end up having won that state. In Pennsylvania, there's an active lawsuit that doesn't make a great deal of sense. It's about the allegation is that the Republican observers were not able to stand close enough to see what was going on, but it doesn't look like there's really any evidence to support that. There is a much more a stronger lawsuit about the 10,000 votes in Pennsylvania, the 10,000 that arrived after Election Day, although they had been voted prior to Election Day. That's actually, for reasons I'll get to in a minute, there is an argument that those votes should not be counted. The thing is, it's only 10,000 votes, so it's not enough to sway the outcome. So I think that legal claim ought to be a loser, but as a matter of prediction, I think it might actually have some legs, but I don't think it moves the result. And I'll talk about why it might have some legs in a minute. In Arizona, Arizona does not allow for requested recounts and only provides for them when the margin is tiny, 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 and it doesn't look like the results are going to be within that tiny margin. So it doesn't look like there's much going on in Arizona that will change things. But of course, Arizona's not done yet. So all in all, what we've got is what we lawyers call a whole bunch of nothing burgers. It's as far as legal claims, but that doesn't mean that they will end up being nothing burgers. So let me just explain for 2 minutes kind of what this how these debates are structured. The Constitution in Article 2, the US Constitution, says each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. There is an argument that a number of members of the current US Supreme Court have endorsed that does not mean the legislature, when legislatures act as interpreted by the state Supreme Court, etc., that means the legislature all by itself gets peculiar priority in terms of not only deciding how electors are chosen, but in terms of interpreting what it itself already decided. In other words, there are members of the Supreme Court who think that state courts don't have much of a role to play in interpreting state law about the choice of electors. That's why the Pennsylvania challenge that says, hey, those votes that were after election day, that were the votes that were voted before election day, but that arrived after election day, they shouldn't be counted. That's based on an idea that the legislature didn't provide for them to be counted, that it was the state Supreme Court that said that those votes should be counted. So this to me, it doesn't make much sense. I think when legislatures act, they act as interpreted by state courts. Like that feels normal to me. But regardless, as I said, that particular challenge doesn't move enough votes to matter. What does matter a little bit more is a different argument. What the requirement under federal law is that the states choose their electors, that they certify their elections by December 8th. If the states don't do that, if for some reason an election is still contested on December 8th, then it's arguable that it remains available to that state legislature to disregard the election and choose electors based on something else, like who they like better. And so what that means is that in the places where Biden has won, or in my view, where Biden has won, but it's still open and contested. But where there's a Republican legislature, it's possible that what we will see going forward is that those Republican legislatures will try to say, the election is still contested as of December 8th. We are going to pick our electors on the basis of who we like, and we like Donald Trump. So that seems, I don't mean that it will happen, but there are 3 states where that's something that could conceivably happen, because there are 3 states that so far seem to have gone for Biden, but that have Republican legislatures: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania legislature said, we're not doing that. And so we'll see what happens in Michigan and Wisconsin. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely, and to be clear, extraordinarily dangerous to democratic norms and to the rule of law. But there is now surfacing some talk on Twitter and the like, talking about seating of electors and the possibility of a Republican legislature revolt. And so this is one of the reasons why it seems so very problematic that that there are these moves being taken to stretch this out and take something that's actually relatively certain and treat it like it's uncertain. Okay, so that's the thing that I wanted to cover, and I think from here we're going to focus back in on Georgia and kind of the political circumstances of Georgia, and then we'll move to the senatorial race in Georgia. And far more expert than I am on Georgia is my colleague Vince Hutchings. Handing the baton back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Margo, and the context you provided. I mean, I know a bit. My primary training is in public opinion polling, so I've been going over some of the exit polls, and I'm going to discuss them briefly here. as a prelude to hopefully generating some questions and a conversation with Margo. And the first thing I guess I want to say is, of course, there's a national exit poll. Actually, there were 2 exit polls at least that were done this past election, the Associated Press exit poll and the National Election Poll exit poll. And but there's also some state exit polls, which is what I'll be referring to, in particular here from Georgia. And I want to just describe some of the noteworthy results from these polls. However, before I make any comments about the exit poll from Georgia, I want to just reiterate a point that I've heard frequently and probably deserves to be emphasized, which is that exit polls are just like any other polls. They are estimates. So these numbers that I'm going to throw out are not necessarily delivered from on high. They're the best estimate in light of all the assumptions built into this particular polling scheme. And it's even more apparent to drive home the point that these are preliminary exit poll results, because unlike with ordinary polls, exit polls have the advantage of describing a result for which we have actual vote tallies. So the actual outcome in Georgia, as is true in other battleground states and across the country, that information will be taken to then later calibrate the exit poll. So these are preliminary in the sense that they'll be modified a bit later once the vote count has been made official. All right, so having said that, a number of things jumped off the page to me as I was looking at the exit polls, and anyone can see them, by the way. You can just go to Google and type in, Georgia exit poll, and you'll find the same results I'm describing. The first, of course, is with respect to gender. There was a fairly large gender gap, although along the lines you might have expected, with men in Georgia being more inclined to vote for President Trump, about 56%, and women more inclined to vote for President-elect, but then former Vice President Joe Biden, to the tune of 54%. So the actual gap is about, depending on how you calculate a gender gap, it's about 12 points, and that's a fairly sizable gender gap historically as these things go. You won't be, I imagine, surprised to learn that far and away the biggest social demographic gap, aside from partisanship in the Georgia contest, both at the presidential level, by the way, and at the level of the Senate, was on the dimension of race. So Georgia, the partisan breakdown in the state is heavily correlated with the racial breakdown in the state. Roughly 30% of the residents in Georgia are African American, and about 60% are white, with the remainder being Latino or some other group. In any case, according to the exit polls, and again, these are estimates, but they're in line with what we would expect, 70% of white voters voted for Donald Trump, and 29% voted for former Vice President Joe Biden. So that is a pretty whopping disparity. It's worth noting that nationally, we would expect something on the order of about 55 or 57% of whites to vote for the Republican ticket. That's indeed what happened in 2020, and also what happened in 2016. So point here being simply that Georgia and the support for Donald Trump was even more lopsided than we would expect nationally. Among African Americans, it runs in the opposite direction, although even more lopsided. 87% of African Americans are reported to, based on the exit poll, voting for former Vice President Joe Biden, and only 11% for President Trump. So that is a extremely large racial divide. It speaks in part, I think, to the emotional nature of the contest. Obviously, race is, I think, arguably the biggest social divide in American politics, and indeed in American history. So we have this partisan divide between the two candidates, and layered on top of it is all the combustible history of the racial divide as well. For what it's worth, if you're wondering about other racial groups in the state, Latinos, who represented about 7% of the electorate in the contest, according to the exit polls, 57% voted for Biden, 41% voted for Trump. And they don't have enough cases to make an estimate for Asian Americans. And for individuals who identify as other, 54% voted for Biden and 35% for Trump. Just a few more here, and then I don't want to belabor the point, but a few other demographic distinctions to make reference to. One is age. Younger voters, those under 44, voted in a bare majority in the range of 55 to 52% for former Vice President Biden, and voters over 45 in roughly the same degree voted for Trump. So there was an age discrepancy as well. Not as exaggerated as we see for race, not even really as exaggerated as we see for gender, but close. As you might expect, it is the case, and we've heard a lot of discussion about this, that there was a discrepancy in terms of white non-college graduates and white college graduates, although in Georgia, both of those demographics voted for Donald Trump. Again, speaking to the power of race, particularly in that state. So according to the exit polls, among white non-college graduates, 80% voted for Donald Trump, 19% for former Vice President Biden. And among white college graduates, the figures are 56% for Trump and 42% for Biden. So clearly education made a difference there, but of course, if you've been paying attention, race made a much bigger difference, because whether they graduated from college or not, they voted whites in the state lean towards the current president. And I just want to make reference to one more detail here, because I could go on, drone on all day if I wasn't stopped. And it's about what was the most important issue in the election that affected your vote. They talked about five. The people who participated in the exit poll were given five options. And I should say too, you may be wondering, how do you do an exit poll in the midst of a pandemic? The exit poll was based on people who voted early, as well as people who voted on election day. And it was supplemented with telephone interviews with people who voted by mail. So pollsters obviously tried to pivot in light of the circumstances of the 2020 election. There's some issues that we might raise as a consequence, like, for example, how can we compare this with previous exit polls, since they used a different methodology, but I'll leave that aside for now. My only point at the moment is that they incorporated the fact that a large number of Americans did not vote on election day. The five issues that were most prominent in that they were provided as options to make their vote decision were racial inequality, the coronavirus pandemic, the economy, crime and safety, and healthcare policy. You might have thought that the coronavirus pandemic would be the most important issue, but the plurality of voters in Georgia, and I believe nationally as well, selected the economy as the most important issue, about 37%. And among that group, Trump dominated. He got 85% of the vote. The second most important issue was not the coronavirus, it was racial inequality, at about 22% of voters in this, at least in this exit poll. And among these voters, Biden dominated. He got 88% of the vote versus 9% for Trump. So I won't walk you through the rest of the coronavirus was the third most important at 13% of the vote. And Biden got the lion's share of that, those individuals who believed that that was the most important issue at 87 versus 12 for Trump. And just to round it out, the latter two were crime and safety and healthcare policy. Crime and safety was a Trump issue. 70% of the people who said that that was an important issue voted for Trump versus 29 for Biden. And finally, healthcare policy was a Biden issue, 79% for the former vice president and 20% for the current president. And I think I'll stop there.
So we want to pivot now to the Senate election, and the Senate, the vote for president in Georgia was essentially down the line 50-50, and that turns out to be true for the Senate race too. Now, Georgia's Senate situation is unusual, right? There were two Senate seats up, one in the ordinary course that was current Republican Senator Perdue versus his Democratic challenger, John Ossoff. And Perdue fell just short of reaching 50%. And under Georgia law, for reasons that I think Vince is going to talk about later, under Georgia law, if you don't surpass 50% by one vote, there's a runoff. And so although Perdue had a bunch more votes, not way more votes, he had he had about 1 percentage point, a little under 1 percentage point more votes. No, that's wrong. Well, in any event, he had about 1 percentage vote more, but it wasn't enough to get past the runoff, and so there will be a runoff. But it was essentially a tie. It was close to a tie. Then there was a special election. Current Republican incumbent Kelly Loeffler was appointed by Governor Kemp in December when her predecessor, also a Republican, resigned for health reasons. And so there was a special election which hadn't had a primary. And so there were over a dozen candidates who ran in the special election. The split by party was essentially 50-50, 49% Republican, 48% Democrats. The Republicans were split about half and half between Loeffler and her Republican competitors. The Democrats consolidated more on Raphael Warnock. He got about 2/3 of the Democratic vote. So he actually had the plurality of votes cast in this election, but just like Perdue, not up to 50%, and therefore there's going to be a runoff. So there will be 2 senatorial races on January 5th, registration by December 7th, and that will determine partisan control of the Senate nationally. If the Democrats were able to win both of those Senate seats, which would be extraordinary, just to be clear, right? This is Georgia we're talking about. They don't typically elect Democratic senators in Georgia. I don't remember when the last one was, but they don't typically elect. On the other hand, they don't typically vote for Democratic presidential candidates in Georgia either, and yet they have. And so, given the extreme efforts on voter registration, voter turnout that the Democrats have made, it's really hard to predict what will happen in this next election. It will be a different electorate in general. Special elections that aren't at the same time as the generals, have decreased participation. Decreased participation tends to help Republicans over Democrats, although, that's not always true. In this particular case, maybe that won't be true. After all, there's no president running. So Donald Trump won't be able to turn out his people for this vote. It's really hard to say what's going to happen. But that's the stakes. The stakes are control of the Senate. If the Democrats can win both seats, it will be 50-50. Vice President-elect Harris will cast the tie vote when needed, and that will give the Democrats a control over the agenda of the Senate. If the Republicans win either one of these senatorial seats, it will go the other way. So that's where we're heading. And I see from my colleague Angela that she wants to know how much of this is about Stacey Abrams. And I don't know, Vince, do you have a view on that? I mean, my view is a lot, but do you have a view?
Yeah, good question. Because this is the short answer is I only have a speculation. I don't have hard evidence, but as with many others, probably those watching and those of us on the call here, it seems like the efforts of Stacey Abrams in terms of generating monies to continually register voters in the state of Georgia and make that a competitive partisan state it's hard to argue that she didn't play an important role. Now, whether it was pivotal and whether there are other people who I'm just not familiar with in terms of Georgia politics who are at least as important, that I can't speak to. But certainly her efforts have contributed, along in all likelihood with some others, in helping to make that state competitive.
So the point is that what's setting up this situation, if we just had, hey, whoever gets the most votes wins, then what we would have here is we would have Senator Perdue would stay senator, and Reverend Warnock would be our new senator. Well, not our new senator, but Georgia's new senator, because they both came in first in their elections. But that is not Georgia's system, and you know, why is somewhat contested. But maybe Vince, I think you were going to speak to
Yeah,
this.
sure. I'll just say a few comments about that. To the extent possible, I'd like to obviously leave time for some Q&A. So, oh, and I will say quickly, because Margo made a comment a moment ago. I think Zell Miller was
Oh, thank you.
the last democratically elected senator in Georgia, the last senator elected who was a member of the Democratic Party. But there's an asterisk by Zell Miller's name because he also, this was in 2000, by the way, he also endorsed George W. Bush, a Republican, obviously, for the presidency. So Miller was a kind of a Democrat in name only. He was a Republican for all intents and purposes. He had a reputation as such, and that's what contributed to his victory. Um, Prior to that, it would maybe be Max Cleland, I think, who had been elected sometime in the 1990s, who was more of a moderate Democrat, but not a kind of a faux Democrat like Zell Miller. In any case, in terms of just quickly the history here, before 1962, Georgia had a kind of a version of the Electoral College, wherein counties were given disproportionate influence in the outcome of statewide elections. This had the effect of dampening the impact of the urban vote, and in particular, as a consequence, the Black vote, given how the composition of the population was and probably still is in the state, in favor, therefore, of less populated counties, which were more rural and hence more white. That was the case prior to 1962, but this was ultimately struck down, this particular pattern, in 1963 by the U.S. Supreme Court under a one-person, one-vote, Baker v. Carr kind of rationale. It's a little hard to defend. It's a little anachronistic in our 2020 perspective to think that that's what they did, but indeed that is what they did in the South. Of course, they did a lot of interesting, creative things in the South in the 1960s. This was just one of them. In any case, it was replaced by a runoff system that was, proposed by Denmark Groover, I believe, who, given the time, was a segregationist. Um, there is some dispute about what was the motivation of this runoff system, the one that Margo's already described. But I think there's a case to be made that's persuasive that the runoff system was specifically designed as a strategy to make it harder for a cohesive yet minority Black vote to coalesce around an individual candidate, allow that candidate to get a plurality and consequently be elected, at least in the initial vote. And so consequently, if, as Margo has already indicated, if such a system were in place, as is true for much of the country, by the way, then we wouldn't need a runoff. But that is not how it plays out in Georgia, probably, or at least plausibly, in part because of an effort to preserve white rule in the state. And yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that for now. And maybe we should start answering questions. Or...
Yeah, the Q&A function seems possibly not to be working. So if you all have a question, put it in the Q&A, and we're testing it even now. So Vince, you and I are going to riff for a little while until that starts working. But what we should say, just to kind of be clear about the position here, I mean, there's two things going on in Georgia, both of which are very interesting, and uh, both of which have like really complicated really complicated politics. So the one is that the Republican establishment in Georgia and in the national administration is trying to keep the Georgia election open and undeclared. And that's kind of creating some extra drama. And although it doesn't seem that it will turn the election, I think it's sort of, to use a sports metaphor, it's all about shots on goal. Like if you can keep the time open, if you can keep the game going, you never know, you might be able to pull out something somehow. And I'll just share that that seems to me to be completely illegitimate and not how democracies work. There's a, you know, in Calvin and Hobbes, there's a thing about Calvin ball, right? Calvin ball is the game that Calvin plays where he always wins because he changes the rules as he's going along, and he makes sure that whatever he's doing, like, that's going to get him the winning goal. And I think the Republicans are playing Calvin ball. That's what I think is going on. And I think, unlike in a cartoon, I think it is dangerous, illegitimate, and a deep problem. Um, so at the same time, there's this stretching out of the senatorial election too. And although there is this origin of this of this not new of this runoff system that I think is persuasively founded in white supremacism, at least we knew the rules in advance. So although I think it might very well be an illegitimate system in some deep way, it's causing me at least less anxiety and less it feels less illegitimate to me. I don't know. Does that seem right to you, or do I have that wrong?
No, not. It's what we're experiencing now is in keeping with maybe current politics and perhaps especially the behavior of Donald Trump. But it's really unprecedented in modern American history to have this sort of thing play out, where there's resistance to accepting the outcome, which is a fairly decisive victory. I mean, Biden nationally has a bigger popular vote margin, with the exception of 2008, I believe, than any candidate since 2000. So it's a pretty big lead. Now, I do see that the Q&A function is working, so I want to make sure we have time to respond to this. I see there's one question about the impact of the Kemp voter roll purges in 2018. This is a reference, of course, to the Stacey Abrams, Brian Kemp gubernatorial contest, which was a narrow victory for the Republican candidate, now current governor, Brian Kemp, who was also, I believe, the Secretary of State at that time. So he was kind of doing double duty. And the question is referencing the efforts to determine the eligibility of some of the folks on the voter rolls in a contest in which he was running for the governor, which seems problematic on its face, but that is nevertheless what happened. So I'm not more dialed into the details. Maybe Margo can speak to this more specifically, but so I'll defer to her.
Yeah, I don't really know. I don't know how many of the people who got purged shouldn't have gotten purged. You know, some people who got purged probably like had in fact moved or whatever. Some I'm sure had not. I don't know how many of those folks got re-registered. I'm really not able to answer that question. I can answer the next question that we see though, which is, has the runoff process ever been challenged as unconstitutional? I actually don't remember, to be honest, whether it was challenged as unconstitutional or whether it was challenged as a violation of the Voting Rights Act. So I want to be clear. I don't remember the answer to that. It was challenged as illegal, however, and the 11th Circuit upheld it. So they found the connection to white supremacism that we've been talking about not sufficiently established to justify striking it down. So there's these other interesting questions about John Ossoff's prospects. I feel like all of this is just completely unknowable, but you're in the polling business. Maybe you're better at crystal balls.
Yeah, it's well, in light of 2016 and even 2020, where clearly the polls overestimated Biden's support to some degree nationally in a number of places, although perhaps not Georgia for what it's worth, but certainly in Wisconsin, for example, the polling pre-election polls were wildly off. So anyway, I just mentioned all that to encourage myself to embrace a little bit of humility here. I don't. So in answer to what's going to happen in the runoff in January, I don't know, because of course I would not have predicted, even with the polls suggesting it was a tight contest, I would not have predicted that Biden would win Georgia, which appears all but certain at this point. Precisely because the last time a Democrat did that, I believe, was Bill Clinton in 1992 in terms of presidential contest. And, you know, the vote was somewhat split because of the presence of Ross Perot on the ticket. So prior to that, it was Jimmy Carter, I think in 76, the last time it had happened. So, okay, what's my point? Miracles can happen, is my point. So, is it possible that Ossoff can win? Well, I mean, yeah. And Margo's already pointed out that the vote tallies for the combined Republican and Democratic candidates in the various contests was not particularly lopsided. It was pretty close. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. Um, so we're getting a lot of questions about the details of Georgia, and it's fair enough, right? We've sort of advertised ourselves as knowing a lot about Georgia, but I have to say I don't actually know that much about Georgia and its politics. I've been following all of this pretty closely, but we got a question of how much did the HBCUs matter, and how about Kamala Harris's sorority, and I think everything matters when a vote is really close. That's the thing about a really close vote. When somebody wins or loses by 10,000 votes, every 10,000 votes matters,
Yeah.
And so I think it all matters, but like, does it matter enough that it's replicable? I just, which seems to me that that's the crucial question right now.
Yeah.
For the Senate race, I don't really know.
I do think it's fair to say, in all honesty, as a prediction, with all the appropriate caveats, that this is an uphill battle for the Democrats. I mean, I think now it doesn't mean they can't win. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's an uphill battle. Traditionally and historically in runoff elections, this is part of the reason Margo and I have been saying what we've been saying about the runoff system. Given that African Americans are aligned with the Democratic Party to the tune of about 85 to 95%, the runoff election, if it does in fact disadvantage blacks, it by definition therefore disadvantages Democrats. So do I think that Republicans have the advantage in this contest? Yes, I do. But again, that doesn't mean that it is impossible.
So another question has come in, which is about the persuasiveness of TV advertisements. I mean, and I'll just say, with, I assume, many people in the audience, that TV advertisements, like, I mean, it's no surprise. I was a political appointee in the Obama administration. Like, I have clear preferences about these elections. And so for me, the TV ads are nothing but annoying. But of course, it doesn't matter what they do for people who are committed to one side or the other. What matters is what they do to the folks at the margin. And I don't know the answer to that. I assume that it's somewhat effective, because why else would anybody spend all that money on it? But Vince, you must
Yeah.
know more about this.
Well, two points. I'll respond to this question about polling, or excuse me, about ads, but there's also a question in here about the polling errors. I want to be responsive to that as well. And again, I'm going to not be very satisfying in my response, however, because I don't know. I think that the polling industry is going to be doing a lot of second guessing here. Now, again, polls are all estimates by definition, so they're not designed to be straight on, completely accurate in that regard, because that's not the nature of the enterprise. But it's clear that there was a pro-Biden bias in many of the battleground state polls. Again, Georgia being an exception to that rule, by the way. That is not the case for the pre-election polls in Georgia. But in many states like Wisconsin, to some degree Michigan and Pennsylvania, they clearly had a pro-Biden bias, or they undercounted Trump support. And it's not yet clear why. It could be because of sample bias. It could be that they discounted the level of enthusiasm of Trump supporters. It could be that Trump supporters are disproportionately inclined not to participate in polls because they don't trust them, or it could be some combination of all three of those. The short answer is that it's too soon to know. On the issue regarding television ads, are they persuasive? It's true that obviously all of the parties and their resources are going to descend on the state of Georgia, given the stakes in the next few weeks. Is that going to make a difference? I mean, it can make a difference, as Margo has indicated, at the margins. But of course, there's a large literature in political science that undercuts, we want to believe that campaigns are what drive most of people's preferences. But the truth of the matter is that their partisan identity is far more consequential than whether or not they see a television ad. So, and it's a very divided partisan environment in Georgia. So the issue isn't so much in terms of persuasion, it's about mobilization. And I don't know if television ads are going to contribute to mobilization, but the jury's still out.
I feel also like, as somebody who doesn't study this, that we don't yet know enough about mobilization in the era of modern multimodal voting. I feel like that our model is mostly one day go to the polls election day voting, and that's not actually the model anymore. That's not what in fact happens anymore. I think that voting by mail in Georgia is fairly limited as I understand their system, but they have early voting that lasts for weeks and is not limited at all. It's very widely used and available. And I think mobilization where you don't have to turn your people out on a given day, but rather you have a lot of chances at them and you can see who voted and you can call back the ones who didn't vote. That feels like a lot of the prior research and prior experience is going to turn out to be inapplicable. And the question will be which party is nimble enough to kind of manage its people in light of that. I don't know. I mean, again, this is more your field than mine, but I've watched a lot of elections and it feels like that to me.
Yeah, I don't have any reasons to doubt that. I think it's we're in uncharted water, of course, because although we haven't discussed it very much, all of this is unfolding in the face of a pandemic that in the winter months is likely to get worse if we are to believe Tony Fauci and a range of other folks. So it's we are usually as social scientists, we are making predictions, however flawed they may be, based on the past. But it's hard. We don't have a past situation like a pandemic in the middle of winter for a runoff election in Georgia. So I mean, it's hard to know what's going to happen. I do still maintain that Republicans have an advantage here, but I don't know how big that advantage may be precisely because it is unfolding under these really unusual circumstances.
There's another question about, well, what are the early voting rules in Georgia for the runoff? And the answer is that there is early voting. There's registration until December 7th, and I believe early voting starts December 14th. So it's the same 3-week period as it was in the generals. Um, and so another person has asked about lines. And there are likely to be lines, but there's 3 weeks of time, so people who care about lines can kind of not go the very first day, maybe not go on a Monday, and time it a little bit for the lines. That said, there were lines in Georgia. There were lines through all of early voting. So, you know, um, they don't have the same kind of mail-in voting that, for example, now our state has, although it's new here. Um, and I don't know what the rules are on drop-off voting in Georgia. I'm just not aware of that. But I believe that the answer is that there's not much because, boy, why would all of those people be waiting in line to vote a different way if there were? But that's just a surmise.
Yeah, that seems plausible to me as well. I don't. Yeah, it's really. I mean, it's a tough one. A lot of voters were motivated on election day and before to come out and support a President Trump or to come out because of their opposition to President Trump. And of course, he won't be on the ballot for the special election. So, I mean, who does that hurt more? I don't know. It's also worth factoring in the following point. Of course, we haven't discussed it up to now, but preliminary estimates suggest that this is the highest share of the population that participated in a presidential election in 120 years. Um, so I mentioned that, and that's relevant for I think, our conversation here today, because folks were clearly motivated either because of enthusiasm or fear or some combination of the two. And that particular pattern will presumably will not be met to the same degree in the runoff. I don't know which party that hurts more. Is that going to hurt the Trump forces or is it going to hurt the Democrats? I don't know.
I see from our colleague, Professor Lynn, Ann Lynn tells us that Georgia has absentee ballot drop off by county. I don't know how easy that is to access or how common it is, but we want to correct any misimpression. Although both Vince and I admitted that we were guessing, I think we might have guessed wrong. Um, so um, so I'd really like to ask a question of Vince, since we seem to now be out of questions from the audience. So I guess what I'm wondering is, does either, I mean, when you see drop off in participation in a second election, is that because people have fatigue, or is it because they think the stakes are lower and so they don't show up, or maybe those are the same? I'm not really sure. Like what turns out to be the motivations of the folks who, of the delta, the people who voted in one but don't vote in the other? Do we have any insight into that?
Well, there is a large literature on participation writ large, and it is in part, it's a range of factors that contribute to it, including in the context of a runoff. But I think it's broadly, my point here is broadly responsive. Socio-demographic factors contribute to a large degree. Formal education in particular, but to a lesser degree, income and occupational status. And that's in part because it's the reality is it's easier for some people to vote than others, because it's easier for them to get time off from work. It's easier for them in terms of their transportation to get to the polling place. Obviously, these long lines are not randomly distributed across Georgia or the country writ large. They are, of course, predominant. We know this by social science, that it's going to be predominantly the case in urban areas and predominantly Black areas, frankly. So, which is to say, Democratic areas. So there is more of a burden in terms of waiting in those areas for those voters. So it's a combination of motivation, Margo, as well as just the ability to vote because of one's resources, and that's partly why, particularly the resources component, Republicans tend to have an advantage. They are going to. Their coalition has, on average, more formal education than is the case for Democratic constituencies. So that gives them an edge. And I'll just say one last thing here, not to filibuster, but it is this notion that the outcome in Georgia with respect to the Senate contest will determine what happens in terms of control of the Senate, which has implications, therefore, for Joe Biden, President-elect Biden, then President Biden's agenda. That point that I just made is not going to be obvious to a large fraction of voters. So, it's sometimes difficult for those of us who, comb through the New York Times every morning, or who watch CNN or Fox or MSNBC, to reconcile ourselves with the fact that most voters don't follow politics. They don't actually know which party is in control of the Senate, and they don't appreciate what it means even to have a majority in the Senate. So the stakes, this has implications for the perception of the stakes. Some people are going to have sufficient political knowledge to recognize that, and some people will not. And that's also going to give an advantage to the Republicans.
Right. So I think we're actually pretty close to the end. So so let me just close off by saying that that I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I'll just have to keep clicking refresh on the sites that I've bookmarked on each of these states. Oh wait, we get one last question. Before the Senate runoff, will they be able to add voting places in the more populated areas? So I don't know the answer about able, but I would say that it is extremely unlikely, as I understand the politics. The Secretary of State in Georgia has no particular interest in expanding the electorate. So I don't know what state law says about that question, but I don't think it's going to happen. But so that's kind of my close. And Vince, you get the last word.
Yeah, I appreciate this opportunity. It was a great conversation with Margo, both in preparation for this event and in the event itself. I learned a lot from listening to her, obviously from the great questions. I agree, by the way, with your assessment as to whether, I don't know if it's possible for them to do so in Georgia, but I understand the partisan composition of the leadership of Georgia, and I understand that they have no incentive to add additional voting places in the middle of a pandemic in the winter. And so I mean, there are practical reasons why they should from a small d Democratic perspective, but given partisan politics, that is almost certainly not going to happen. So let's all just pay attention and watch and see what happens. We've been surprised before by Georgia. We may well be surprised again. And I just want to thank the organizers of this event for the opportunity to engage in this very fruitful conversation.
Thanks, everyone, and good night.